The Friday evening rush had taken over the little Italian restaurant on the corner of Maple Street. The air was filled with the aroma of garlic, roasted tomatoes, and freshly baked bread. Families chatted over steaming pasta, couples leaned close over candlelit tables, and waiters hurried past balancing trays of plates. Amid the noise and laughter, a man sat alone in the far corner. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, his watch gleamed under the warm light, and his every movement carried the unshakable composure of someone used to being in control. He was Daniel Whitmore, billionaire CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, a man feared in boardrooms and admired on magazine covers. But tonight, Daniel looked less like a titan of industry and more like a weary traveler, flipping through a stack of papers while absent-mindedly sipping his wine. On the table beside his untouched dinner lay a sleek leather folder containing documents, contracts for another acquisition that would add to his empire. The top page bore his sharp, practiced signature in bold ink. As he read over the details, he hardly noticed the waitress approaching. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with soft brown eyes and a quiet grace in the way she carried herself. Her uniform was slightly loose, her dark hair tied back in a bun that struggled to contain stray curls. She held a tray against her hip and gave him a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir. May I take your plate?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded without looking up, sliding the plate toward her. But instead of lifting it immediately, the girl's eyes drifted to the folder on the table. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned closer to the page. Her eyes widened as if she were staring at something impossible. "Sir," her voice wavered, almost too soft to be heard over the clatter of dishes around them. "That's my dad's signature." Daniel blinked, lifting his gaze in surprise. "What?" She pointed, her finger hovering just above the ink on the contract. "The way it loops, the way the H is written, that's exactly how my father signed everything. I'd recognize it anywhere." For a man who had built his life on composure, Daniel's reaction was uncharacteristic. His hand, still holding his wine glass, slipped. The stem shattered against the floor, red liquid spreading like blood across the pristine white tablecloth. Conversations around them hushed as heads turned, but Daniel didn't hear the murmurs. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the girl. Her words clawed at his memory. That signature wasn't just a flourish of ink, it belonged to Richard Hale. His old mentor. His partner. His brother in everything but blood. The man who had vanished 20 years ago under a cloud of scandal and betrayal. Daniel had never seen him again. Until now, through his daughter's eyes. The waitress looked at him nervously, as though afraid she had said something wrong. But Daniel couldn't move. For the first time in years, the unshakable billionaire CEO sat frozen, undone by a name he thought he'd buried forever. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but Daniel remained frozen in his seat, his thoughts spiraling back to a time he had tried so hard to bury. The waitress, still crouched near the shards of glass, looked up at him with concern. I'm sorry," she stammered, reaching for a cloth to mop up the spilled wine. "I didn't mean to upset you. The signature, it startled me. My father used to sign everything that way." Daniel's throat tightened. He leaned forward, his voice low, almost hoarse. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "Emily. Emily Hale." The sound of that name was like a punch to his chest. Hale. It confirmed the truth he already feared. She wasn't just mistaken, she was connected to him. To Richard Hale. The man Daniel had once trusted more than anyone. The man whose disappearance had left behind a trail of broken partnerships, unanswered questions, and a scar on Daniel's life he never fully healed from. He steadied his voice. "Emily, where is your father now?" Emily's expression shifted, the brightness in her eyes dimming. She drew in a shaky breath and placed the cloth back on the table. "He passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." It was fast, and we didn't have the money for treatment. He kept painting until the end, though. He signed every canvas with that mark. Said it was part of him. Daniel's chest ached at her words. Painting. Richard had always doodled sketches during late-night meetings, claiming he needed to balance the numbers with colors. Daniel used to laugh at the habit, teasing him for mixing art and business. And now, knowing that Richard had spent his final years with a brush instead of a briefcase, the laughter turned into something bitter in his throat. Emily looked at him curiously, her brows furrowed. You recognized it too, didn't you? You knew my father. Daniel's lips parted, but the words caught. How could he explain? To tell her he and Richard had once been inseparable, that they had dreamed of building a legacy together, only for it to collapse under the weight of betrayal? That Daniel had believed Richard had stolen from him, forged documents, destroyed the empire they had built with their own hands? Could he tell her that he had spent years despising the man she still spoke of with love? Finally, he forced a reply, his voice guarded. We crossed paths once. A long time ago. Emily studied him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. She wanted to ask more, but the rush of customers called her back. I should get back to work, she murmured, gathering the empty plates. Yet before she walked away, she added softly, you look like someone who carries his name heavily too. Daniel sat in silence long after she left, staring at the stains spreading across the tablecloth. For 2 decades, he had told himself Richard Hale's story ended in betrayal. But now, with his daughter standing before him, Daniel realized the past wasn't finished with him. Not by a long shot. The following evening, Daniel returned to the restaurant. He told himself it was coincidence, that he simply wanted a quiet meal away from the polished pretentiousness of luxury dining. But deep down, he knew the truth, he wanted to see Emily again. He needed answers that only she might unknowingly hold. When she approached his table with the same cautious smile, he noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked exhausted, yet she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that reminded him painfully of Richard. As she placed a glass of water before him, Daniel cleared his throat. Emily, he said, keeping his tone gentle, I hope you don't mind me asking, but, what kind of man was your father? The question caught her off guard. She bit her lip, her eyes softening with the weight of memory. He was complicated, she began. Kind, but sad. He loved to paint, but he never showed his work to anyone outside our home. He always seemed like he was carrying a heavy secret, something he could never quite say out loud. Sometimes I'd find him staring at old photographs, just lost. Daniel's heart clenched. He remembered Richard doing the same in their youth, staring at pictures of their first small office, their first big client, their dream to change the business world. Back then, the only weight Richard carried was ambition. Emily continued, lowering her voice. Before he died, he told me he regretted something that cost him the most important friendship of his life. I never knew who he meant. He never said your name. The words cut deep. Daniel felt a sting in his eyes and quickly looked away, staring at the flickering candle on the table. Could it be true? Had Richard never betrayed him at all? Could the scandal that destroyed them have been a setup? I think he wanted to make it right, Emily added softly, but time ran out. Daniel drew in a slow, steady breath. He wanted to tell her everything, about the accusations, the missing funds, the signature on those contracts that matched hers so perfectly. But a part of him hesitated. What if she blamed him for not defending her father? What if the truth tore down the last good image she had of Richard Hale? Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out one of the contracts he had been working on. He pointed to the bold scrawl at the bottom. Emily, when you see this, are you absolutely sure it's your father's? Her eyes welled with tears as she traced the loops with her finger. Positive. I've seen him sign like this my whole life. This is his mark. Daniel's pulse quickened. Someone had used Richard's identity, his signature, to to destroy everything. Suddenly, the narrative of betrayal he had believed for 20 years crumbled. And as Emily looked at him with pleading eyes, Daniel knew one thing for certain: the truth had been buried, and it was his responsibility to dig it out, not just for Richard's memory, but for the daughter who deserved to know who her father really was. Daniel could no longer ignore the gnawing in his chest. The pieces didn't add up: Richard's disappearance, the forged documents, the scandal that ruined their partnership. Emily's certainty about her father's signature made everything clear: Richard had been framed. For 2 decades, Daniel had carried anger where there should have been questions, and now he was determined to uncover the truth. Using his vast resources, Daniel launched a quiet investigation. Old files were pulled, forgotten testimonies re-examined, financial trails followed. What emerged was damning. It hadn't been Richard who forged the contracts or siphoned money, it was another executive, a man who had later risen to prominence by stepping into the void left by Richard's disgrace. Richard had been a scapegoat, sacrificed to protect the real culprit. And Daniel, blinded by betrayal, had believed the worst of his friend. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on his shoulders. He thought of Richard, alone in his final years, carrying shame for crimes he never committed. He thought of Emily, working long shifts as a waitress, never knowing her father's brilliance had been stolen from him. Daniel knew what he had to do. 2 weeks later, at a press conference crowded with journalists, Daniel stood behind a podium. Cameras flashed, voices buzzed, but he kept his gaze steady. Emily stood at the edge of the stage, clutching one of her father's paintings to her chest for courage. 20 years ago, Daniel began, his voice carrying both strength and sorrow. A man named Richard Hale was accused of crimes that destroyed his career and reputation. He was my partner, my mentor, my closest friend. I believed lies that painted him as a thief. Today, I reveal the truth: Richard Hale was innocent. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying across notepads. Daniel continued, holding up the recovered evidence that proved Richard had been framed. The real guilty party was uncovered, and the world deserves to know that Richard Hale's name should never have been dragged through the mud. He was not a criminal, he was a visionary. As the flashes intensified, Daniel's voice faltered for the first time. And he was a good man, one I failed to stand by. For that, I will carry regret all my life. But his daughter, Emily, carries his legacy forward, and I vow to honor him through her. When the conference ended, Daniel stepped aside. Emily approached, her eyes brimming with tears. She set the painting down and wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave him back the dignity he deserved." Daniel held her tightly, his voice low but firm. "No, Emily. You gave me the chance to see the truth. I can't change the past, but I can make sure his story is told right. And I'll be here for you, always." For the first time in years, Daniel felt a burden lift from his soul. A signature had once shattered his world, but now it had mended something far greater: the bond between a daughter seeking justice and a man finally brave enough to face the truth.